back, AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to overview the FRQs, which you will find on the Unit 8 exam. The first bullet is what we call the approach avoidance conflict. This information can be found in Essential Task 8.2. An approach avoidant conflict occurs when you have one option. That's very important. That single option, though, has both good and bad. So it has both good and bad. So for example, you may very well have been accepted to a college that fits really all of your criteria, but it's incredibly expensive. That would be what we call an approach avoidant conflict, where you have one option in front of you. It has a lot of good and a lot of bad. Don't be confused with other versions of conflicts. For example, an approach conflict is when you have two good options in front of you and you have to select one of them. And avoidance conflict is when you have two bad options and you kind of need to pick between the lesser of two evils. Those two examples are when you have two options in front of you. The approach avoidance conflict does not follow that same pattern. This is when you have one option in front of you and you have to determine if the good outweighs the bad. This scenario can be stressful. For example, if you really enjoy playing sports, but you want to invest more time into your studies so you can improve your GPA in anticipation of college, choosing to play sports might be an approach avoidance conflict, where there's a lot of good, you enjoy the sport, but you also have to outweigh the bad, whether or not the time spent on sports is going to hinder your GPA. The second bullet is what we call incentive theory. Incentive theory is very closely aligned with what we called operant conditioning back in Unit 6. The idea that if a behavior is followed by some type of desirable outcome, that behavior will continue. In this case, we're talking about motivation and motivation theory. The way you would approach this bullet would be to state that there's some type of desirable outcome that motivates a given behavior. So for example, you could say studying for 1 hour is followed by $5. If you live in a house or you live with parents or guardians or family members that are using incentive theory, this would be a great way to incentivize you to study. After you study, that is followed by a $5 incentive. Back in Unit 6, we would call that something like a reinforcement, in this case, a positive reinforcement. Incentive theory and what we described as operant conditioning are more or less synonyms of one another. So to approach an incentive theory bullet, you need to describe some type of desirable outcome, like winning a contract, or winning money, or getting praise, that follows some type of given behavior, usually a target behavior like studying. The third bullet is what we call the over-justification effect. This information can be found on Essential Task 8.2. In order to really understand the over-justification effect, you need to understand the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. These bullets are actually quite probable on the AP exam themselves, so the entirety of this bullet is great practice. You'll cover an over-justification effect, but we'll also synthesize the difference between in and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation means you love the behavior. Really, just for the sake of it. I'm talking about your main hobbies, ones that you would do even without a reward. So if you really like to paint, even though it's not your career, if you really like to play music and it's not your career, you're not getting rewarded for it, you would simply do it for the sake of doing it. You are intrinsically motivated. If you love to play sports, even though you have no aspirations of playing in college or going professional, you just love baseball or softball or basketball, you are intrinsically motivated. Extrinsic motivation, though, is when you're motivated by things like fame, things like fortune, the paycheck. When I was in high school, I worked in a nursing home, in the kitchen. I continued that into college. I didn't dislike my job by any means necessary, but I certainly wouldn't do it for free. I was extrinsically motivated to go to work. I went to work for the purposes of getting a paycheck. I wouldn't show up to work and work for free. If there is a behavior that you would simply do for free, you are intrinsically motivated. The overjustification effect is when you are already intrinsically motivated. So let's say you love to paint, but then you become extrinsically motivated. So let's say you really love to paint, then you get hired as a painter. Now all of a sudden you're painting what other people want on their schedule, when they want, how they want, and as a result, your overall love for painting decreases. So, as a result, now your intrinsic motivation drops. Intrinsic motivation drops. You grow to dislike whatever you had a passion for. So now you dislike painting. You grew up, your whole life painting was your number one hobby. You would do it even without a reward. You loved it just for the sake of it. However, now that you've been hired, and now you're doing it for a paycheck, maybe you're trying to become famous, you have to do it the way others want, and now your love for painting drops. So this could be applied really to any scenario. Art, music, sport, whatever it might be. So when you love something, then you start to get a paycheck, and now your love for that topic drops considerably. So when you're intrinsically motivated already, then become extrinsically motivated, and as a result, the intrinsic motivation drops. It's important to outline each of these steps in a bullet. Already love it, then you start to get paid for it, now you dislike doing it. The fourth bullet is what we call the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. If you took a look at the 8-4 concept map, you will find this information. You will also find a corresponding video where I overviewed the 4 theories of emotion, including the Schachter-Singer theory. This one can be a little tricky, but let's talk about how you would approach it. The example that we're going to use is a class presentation. The way this theory works is you encounter some type of stimulus. If you watched the video that corresponded to this concept map on Prezi, and I also included it on Google Classroom, you might recognize these symbols, but I'll overview them briefly for everyone again. The eye is supposed to represent some type of stimulus, encountering something. So I'm going to write over here, called on. That is the stimulus. A teacher has called on you to give your class presentation. Then, as a result of being called on, you begin to experience what we call physiological arousal. I represent that with this red heart, but in an actual FRQ, you should write arousal, and you should give an example, something like an increase in your heart rate. It could also be something like sweating, but in an FRQ, you should describe the type of arousal. Maybe some of you can relate to this so far. You get called on, then your heart starts to beat. Then, according to this theory of emotion, you have to think. You need to apply cognition, and you question in that moment, why is my heart racing? What am I experiencing? Well, for those of you who have undergone this scenario, the reason your heart's racing could very well be the last phase of this, which is the emotion, which might be, in this circumstance, nerves. You might feel nervous. If you feel nervous before giving a presentation, you very easily could do a worse job because of your appraisal of your physiological arousal as being a result of nerves. You certainly don't want to give a class presentation while nervous. So this Schachter-Singer two-factor theory could very easily explain why you do poorly on some type of class performance or performance in general. You get called on. That's the introduction of a stimulus. You experience physiological arousal, which in this case is your heart racing, which you should describe in an FRQ. Then you have to stop and think, why is my heart racing? We call this blue phase cognitive labeling. Label your arousal. What is my body doing? Why am I sweating? Why is my heart racing? Why am I breathing faster? If you sit there and realize that you're nervous before giving a presentation, you might attribute or praise that physiological arousal as nerves, and then walk up in front of the class and do a worse job. You could, in theory also, flip this around. So it depends on what you see on the FRQ for this class's exam or for the actual AP exam. But the emotion can actually be excitement too. You might be walking up, amped up, ready to go. My heart's racing. Why is my heart racing? Because my body is amped up, ready to go. So the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory could actually be applied to explain a desirable outcome. It really depends on what you decide to do in this last step of the process. Regardless, the first three steps need to be indicated in an FRQ. Some type of stimulus is encountered. You see a bear, you get called on, you are told you're presenting next. Your body then responds, physiological arousal, like an increase in heart rate. Then you stop and think, what does that mean? Why is my heart racing? Once you've determined, or at least decided individually why your heart is racing, you then experience a corresponding emotion. Whether that's fear or excitement, it can go in either direction. If the prompt asks, how does this theory hinder your performance? Write nerves, write nervousness, talk about how that's hindering your performance. If it asks how it's going to help, identify things like excitement, or that you're amped up, or that you're focused. Those would all be great examples of why this theory could potentially help your performance. The fifth bullet on the FRQ is what we call the Yerkes-Dodson law. There's no multiple choice on the AP exam this year. However, if this was represented, it's always an upside-down U. That's always how this is visualized. The Yerkes-Dodson law argues that for your most ideal performance, meaning the best performance that you could possibly give on a class presentation, in a sporting event, doesn't matter, relates to two variables. The higher the overall complexity of the task you're doing, it's more ideal to be cool, calm, and collected, to have lower levels of arousal. So, for example, if you're playing in the state championship game, we are going to assume that's highly complex, which would mean your best performance, due to the high complexity, would occur if you had lower overall arousal, meaning you were cool, calm, and collected. You weren't too amped up, you weren't too psyched out, you were focused but calm, and you had your best overall performance. You could, however, flip this the other way. This is how it helps. Your worst performance, though, would be if you were too excited. So if you see this bullet and it asks, how does this concept help you? You would say, if the task is complex, the prompt might not always tell you if the task is complex. However, you can pick, and if you state that the task is complex and then approach the FRQ accordingly, that would score. If you say the task is complex, low arousal is ideal. If you show up with lower arousal, your best performance happens, you're cool, calm, and collected. However, your worst performance could easily happen if you were too excited or too amped up. You might stumble over your words, you might psych yourself out, you might make mistakes that you don't normally make. Doesn't matter. All of those are proper examples. It sort of just depends. Is it asking you why this helps or why this hurts? If it asks why it helps, you showed up cool, calm, and collected. You were not too amped up, not too psyched out, and you did well. Or alternatively, if it asks why does this concept hinder, you got too amped up, too excited, made mistakes you might normally make. The final bullet is what we call the exhaustion phase of general adaptation syndrome. This is found in the Essential Task 8.1 concept map. I referenced back when we actually took this one in class that the general adaptation syndrome bullets historically spell out this really elongated name, but you really just need to look at the first part, the exhaustion phase. This isn't necessary in the FRQ, but that is the third in the three phases, according to Selye. The first was alarm, the second was resistance, and the third here is exhaustion. So we are talking about the third phase. That aspect is not necessary to score. However, just to clarify, what you would actually need to write in a bullet would be these following things. Your body is no longer coping with stress. During the resistance phase, the second phase, your body is dealing with long-term stress. It is not dealing with long-term stress anymore in the exhaustion phase. It's almost impossible to score if you do not include this element. You need to include the word stress somewhere, or it's really almost impossible to score. So that part's really important. But you need to add a little bit more. What does your body do now? Well, it could collapse. You could theoretically die. You certainly have a weakened immune system. When you have a weakened immune system, that means you're more vulnerable to getting the flu, more vulnerable to getting a cold. Those are all obviously negative, detrimental effects of being in the exhaustion phase of the general adaptation syndrome, which means as a result, this bullet always hinders. It's never going to be considered a good thing. So this might make you miss practice because you're sick, you can miss school, you can miss a competition, you can miss work. If you have a weakened immune system and now you're sick and you have the flu, you certainly can come up with a myriad of reasons why that's going to hinder basically anything that you do. It's going to hurt at school, it's going to hurt if you're playing a sport, it's going to hurt in preparation for a big exam, it's going to hurt in everything across the board. So in a bullet, I'm going to look for no longer coping with stress and something listed here on number 2. Collapse, death, weakened immune system, and then a very clear example about why a weakened immune system is going to hinder you, for example, in school. You might not be able to study. You might miss valuable classes. That's certainly going to hinder your overall performance in school.